The wind was a blade, finding every tear in the threadbare shawl, every gap in the broken wall she huddled against. It had been days or maybe weeks. Time had bled into a gray ache since they left her on the outskirts of nowhere, the raw wound a burning testament to her failure. A girl, as if the sex of a child was a curse to be borne by the mother alone. Her strength, leached away by blood loss and despair, was barely enough to hold her daughter, bundled tight against the cold, against her own failing heart. The child, small and silent, was a fragile weight in her arms, a tiny, innocent reason for the cruelty that had been visited upon them. Fear was a constant, cold knot in her gut. Fear of the wild, of the cold, of the hunger that gnawed. But mostly fear of people. The kind of people who could look upon a newborn and its mother and see only shame and inconvenience. They had offered no shelter, no food, only judgment and the order to disappear. The land stretched out, vast and indifferent, beneath a sky the color of bruised lead. There were no roads here, only tracks leading away, back to the world that had expelled her. Each breath was shallow, painful. Her body trembled, not just from the cold, but from the lingering shock, the raw exhaustion. She pressed her face into the soft cotton binding her daughter, inhaling the faint, sweet scent of her, clinging to this one small life that was entirely hers, despite everything. This child, this proof of her womanhood, had cost her everything, yet was the only thing she had left. Then, a shadow detached itself from the horizon. A man on horseback, moving slow and steady across the desolate plains. Her first instinct was terror. Men had brought her to this. Men had judged her. But the horse didn't ride towards her. It moved parallel, far off, heading towards a cluster of low buildings barely visible in the distance. A homestead, impossibly far. She watched, a flicker of something other than despair stirring within her. Could that be salvation? Or another source of cruelty? She didn't move, didn't call out. Her voice was a dry whisper even in her own ears. She simply watched the lone rider shrink against the immensity of the land. A solitary figure in a world that seemed determined to erase small, broken things. He saw her. She was sure of it. The way his head subtly turned, the pause in his horse's gait. Even from this distance, she felt the weight of his gaze. He didn't approach. Not then. He continued towards the buildings. A part of her heart sank, heavy as stone. Abandoned again, left for the elements to claim. She closed her eyes, pulling the child tighter, resigning herself to the inevitable. The cold seeped deeper, the wound throbbed, and the wind mourned around her. It felt like the end of the world. But the man returned. Hours later, maybe, the sun lower, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. He rode closer this time, stopping a cautious distance away. He was a study in angles and dust, gaunt face, worn clothes, hands that looked used to hard labor. He didn't speak. His eyes, sharp and assessing under the brim of a worn hat, took in her huddled form, the bundle in her arms, the stark vulnerability. There was no pity in his gaze, but neither was there the disgust she had come to expect. Just a quiet, weary observation. He was a man who seemed to have seen too much, expected too little. He dismounted, his movements deliberate. He carried nothing. He simply stood there, a silent, solid presence against the wind. She watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the moment. Judgment, rejection, the final pushing away. But he didn't move closer. He didn't speak. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions and the harsh reality of their meeting. It was an impossible situation. Two strangers bound by the raw, empty space between them, one desperate, one watchful. The wind howled, filling the void, carrying the dust of the land that cared nothing for their plight. He simply waited. He was Silas. That was the first thing she learned, though not from his lips. He didn't offer his name, not at first. He had simply lifted her, stiff and awkward in his arms, as if she were a sack of feed, carrying her to his horse. He moved with a quiet strength that surprised her. She expected roughness, indifference. Instead, There was only efficiency. He bundled her onto the horse, then retrieved her child, holding the tiny bundle with an unexpected tenderness that felt jarring against his rough exterior. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't ask who she was. He simply turned the horse towards the low buildings she had seen earlier and rode. The buildings were sparse, functional. A small, two-room house listing slightly to one side, a collapsing barn, a corral holding a few gaunt horses. It was the homestead of a man barely holding on, a mirror of her own precarious state. Inside, the air was cold, smelling of dust and old wood smoke. He didn't help her down. He simply dismounted and waited for her to slide off the horse's back, her injured side screaming in protest. She nearly fell, catching herself on the horse's neck. He didn't offer a hand, but he didn't turn away either. It was a silent test, perhaps, of her remaining strength. He led her inside. The single main room was dominated by a stone hearth, cold and empty. A rough table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot against one wall. That was all. No comforts, no unnecessary items.
Survival stripped bare.
He gestured towards the cot with a nod of his head. Sit. His voice was low, gravelly, like stones shifting. It was the first word he had spoken. She sank onto the cot, the relief of not having to stand momentarily overriding the pain. He moved to the hearth, kneeling, methodically building a fire with dry wood. The scrape of flint against steel filled the silence. A spark caught, then another, and soon small flames were licking at the kindling, pushing back the cold. The heat was a blessing, seeping into her frozen limbs. He didn't speak again. His attention focused on the fire, ensuring it took hold. He left the room and returned a moment later with a bucket of water and a piece of worn cloth. He knelt beside her cot, his movements still economical. He didn't look at her face, his gaze fixed on her bandaged side, the rough cloth stained dark with old blood. Without a word, he carefully began to unwrap the binding. She tensed, bracing herself for pain, for judgment. But his touch was surprisingly gentle, steady. He cleaned the wound with the cool water, his brow furrowed in concentration. It stung, but less than she expected. It was clean, but deep, already showing signs of festering around the edges. He worked in silence, his hands capable, familiar with injury. When he was finished, he re-wrapped it with a cleaner, though still worn, strip of cloth. He stood, his task complete. He didn't ask how it happened. He didn't ask about her husband, the child's father, the people who had left her. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You need food," he said, his voice flat. He went to a small cupboard, taking out a piece of dried meat and a hard biscuit. He placed them on the table. "Eat." He offered no shared meal, no conversation. He moved about the room, attending to small tasks, banking the fire, checking the door latch, as if she were simply another fixture in his Spartan life, requiring basic maintenance. He didn't interact with the child, sleeping soundly now on the cot beside her. He acknowledged her presence, provided the essentials for survival, but offered no warmth, no reassurance. It was a transactional kindness, born perhaps of a solitary man's code, or simply the harsh practicality of the frontier where you didn't leave things to die on your doorstep if you could manage otherwise. She ate the dry food slowly, watching him. He was a mystery, this silent man who had rescued her from the brink, yet remained distant, unreachable. She was grateful, profoundly so, but still utterly alone in his presence. He simply was, and in this desolate place that was enough. For now. Weeks turned into months. The initial awkwardness of her presence in Silas's silent world slowly gave way to a quiet routine. He didn't speak much more than was necessary, his words clipped and purposeful. Fire needs wood, water, snow's coming. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the tension in his shoulders, the set of his jaw. He was a man constantly braced against the world. Her physical strength returned slowly. The wound healed, leaving a tight, angry scar. With healing came the need to contribute. She couldn't simply exist on his meager resources. She began small, sweeping the dusty floor, mending his worn clothes with thread pulled from unraveling sacks, tending the small fire while he was out from dawn till dusk. He didn't ask her to. She simply did it. He acknowledged her efforts with a silent nod, sometimes leaving a bit more food for her and the child than for himself. It was a silent contract forming between them. She offered her labor, he offered shelter. Her daughter, Anya, began to thrive. The warmth of the cabin, meager as it was, the consistent if plain food, and Alara's constant presence brought color to her cheeks and strength to her small limbs. Silas paid the child little direct attention, but Alara noticed things. How he ensured the door was securely latched against the cold wind. How he sometimes left a small, smooth stone on the table where Anya could find it. How his gaze would sometimes linger on the child when he thought Alara wasn't watching, a flicker of something unreadable in his deep-set eyes. He protected them in his quiet, deliberate way. Alara learned about Silas not from his words, but from his world. The calloused hands, the deep lines etched around his eyes from squinting into the distance, the way he handled his few tools with respect. He was a man who worked the land, fought against its harshness, and expected little in return. She saw the evidence of his struggles everywhere, the patched roof, the threadbare blankets, the constant mending of fences and tack. He was as vulnerable as she was, just in a different way. His vulnerability was against the land, the elements, the sheer difficulty of wresting a living from this unforgiving place. Her vulnerability had been against society, against the judgment of men. One evening, the fire low, the wind rattling the window pane, Alara was mending a tear in his coat. Anya slept soundly on the cot. Silas sat at the table, cleaning his rifle, the only sound the methodical click and slide of metal. Alara broke the silence. "Why did you bring us here?" He stopped, the rifle barrel halfway through a cleaning rag. He looked at her, his expression guarded. The silence stretched, the firelight dancing in his eyes. She braced herself for a simple, practical answer. Necessity. Convenience. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual. "Didn't seem right. Leaving you, that was all. Not a declaration of compassion. Not a grand gesture. Just the simple negation of a wrong action." It was perhaps the most human thing he had said since she arrived. It wasn't charity. It was a refusal to participate in the cruelty she had experienced. A quiet defiance. The next day, the sky turned a brutal, bruised purple. The wind rose to a howl, carrying the first biting snowflakes. A blizzard was coming. Silas spent the morning securing everything outside, his face grim. Alara helped where she could, bringing in kindling, boarding up the loose window in the barn. There was an unspoken tension in the air, a shared understanding of the danger. This wasn't just bad weather. It was a test of survival. They stocked the fire, checked their meager food stores. Fear, a familiar companion, coiled in Alara's stomach, but this time it was different. It wasn't the helpless terror of being abandoned. It was the fear of fighting for survival, side by side with this silent man, against a formidable, indifferent enemy. The cabin became their fortress, small and fragile, against the white fury gathering outside. The test was upon them, and they would face it together, two survivors and a small child, huddled against the storm. The blizzard raged for 3 days. The world outside vanished behind a curtain of white. The wind screamed around the cabin, a relentless, mournful sound. Inside, they lived by the rhythm of the fire and the dwindling pile of wood. Each log burned was a small victory, a stay against the cold that seeped through the walls. Their world shrank to the confines of the small room, illuminated only by the firelight and a single sputtering lamp. Fear was a tangible presence, a cold hand on the back of her neck whenever the wind gusted violently, or Silas checked the woodpile with a worried frown. But alongside the fear was a growing sense of quiet resolve. They were in this together. Silas rationed the food meticulously, ensuring Anya always had the best portion. He kept the fire going, his face etched with weariness but his movements steady. Alara tended to Anya, kept their few blankets warm, and watched him, her initial fear of him replaced by a watchful respect. On the second night, the wind tore a section of sod from the roof. Snow began to drift down near the hearth. Silas reacted instantly, grabbing a heavy blanket, climbing onto the table, trying to stuff the gap. The cold air blasted in, stealing the warmth. He worked with a desperate urgency, the muscles in his arms straining. Alara didn't hesitate. She found a length of rope, holding it taut as he tied off the blanket, bracing the table as he shifted his weight. They worked in silence, their breath pluming in the sudden cold, their hands brushing occasionally in the dim light. It wasn't an act of heroism. It was a necessity, a desperate struggle against the elements threatening to overwhelm them. They were a unit forged in the shared need to survive. When it was done, they sank back, breathless. Silas looked at her across the room, the firelight flickering across his face. For the first time, his gaze held something other than assessment or stoicism. It was a look of shared exhaustion, shared risk, shared survival. A flicker of acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude. Alara met his gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. They had faced the storm together. When the blizzard finally broke, the silence that followed was heavy, absolute. The world outside was buried under feet of snow, transformed into a vast, white wilderness. They had survived. They were bone-weary, hungry, but alive. The cabin was colder, draftier, but it stood. As the first pale light filtered through the single window, Alara looked at Silas. He was standing by the hearth, staring into the low embers, his shoulders slumped. He looked defeated, despite their survival. She went to the window, pushing aside the frost. The landscape was brutal, beautiful, empty. "We made it," she said softly. He turned, his eyes meeting hers. There was a long pause. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "We made it." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The struggle, the fear, the small acts of mutual reliance. They had said everything that needed to be said. The following spring was hard. Melting snow brought mud and hardship. Their supplies were dangerously low, but they faced it together. Alara, no longer the injured, helpless woman, worked alongside Silas. She wasn't as strong, but she was tenacious. She helped mend the fences, clear the debris, plant the small, hopeful garden. Silas didn't treat her like a burden. He treated her like a partner, albeit a quiet one. He taught her how to handle the horses, how to mend a plow. She taught him, perhaps nothing practical, but something about the quiet strength of endurance, about finding purpose even after being cast out. They never spoke of the past, of the people who had left her, of the life she had lost. It hung unspoken between them, a ghost banished by the demands of the present. Their relationship wasn't one built on romance or grand declarations. It was built on shared work, mutual respect, and the simple fact that they had faced the worst together and chosen not to break. He had given her shelter when she had none, a chance to rebuild, a quiet acceptance that she and her daughter simply were. One evening, sitting outside as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and rose, Anya playing nearby with a smooth stone, Silas spoke, not looking at Alara. "This land, it takes more than it gives." Alara looked out at the vast, empty space. "Maybe," she said, her voice calm, "but it doesn't judge." He was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "No," he agreed, "it doesn't judge." She had come to this place broken, cast out, defined by the rejection of others. She had found refuge not in a man's affection, but in his quiet practicality, his refusal to turn away. She had learned that resilience wasn't about fighting the past, but about building the future, one difficult day at a time. She had found strength in her own hands, her own determination, and in the silent partnership forged in the crucible of shared hardship. This desolate ranch, this quiet, wounded man, and her small, thriving daughter, they were not the life she had expected, but they were a life built on solid ground. She was no longer defined by abandonment, but by survival. She was a woman who had faced the storm, both outside and within, and found her own quiet, indomitable dignity in the enduring light of a new dawn. This was not a fairy tale ending, but it was an ending filled with a profound, hard-won peace.